The officers stood frozen as the chief and his son disappeared around the corner. Their mistakes had been laid bare, their actions exposed. It was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. They had underestimated the wrong boy, and now they would have to face the consequences of their assumptions. For Chief Washington, this moment was a small but meaningful victory. It wouldn't erase the biases that lingered in Oakwood, but it was a step toward something better, toward a community where fairness and respect could thrive. Jimmy's steps grew lighter as they approached his grandmother's house, the smell of cookies already wafting through the air. And as they walked through the door, both father and son knew they had stood up for what was right, and that mattered. Jimmy Washington, a bright-eyed 13-year-old with a heart full of curiosity, walked briskly through the quiet streets of Oakwood. The sun was setting, casting warm, golden hues on the suburban neighborhood. Oakwood wasn't just any place for Jimmy. It was home to his grandmother, the woman who made every visit feel like a comforting retreat. Her house was a haven, always filled with the sweet aroma of freshly baked cookies, the melody of her humming, and the warmth of her embrace. But today felt different. As Jimmy strolled with a small box tucked under his arm, an early birthday gift for his grandmother, a strange unease prickled the back of his neck. Glancing over his shoulder, he spotted two uniformed officers trailing him. At first, he brushed it off. After all, Oakwood was a safe neighborhood, and the presence of police officers often meant protection. Yet their steps quickened. The officers, Grant and Baker, bore expressions as rigid as stone, their sharp eyes locked onto Jimmy like hawks tracking prey. A lump formed in Jimmy's throat. He couldn't quite place why, but an ominous tension hung in the air. Their intent didn't feel protective. It felt invasive. Trying to shake off the growing fear, Jimmy reached for his phone. His father, Andre Washington, had recently become the town's police chief, and his voice echoed in Jimmy's mind. "If you ever feel unsafe, call me immediately. Don't hesitate." Jimmy didn't hesitate. His hands trembled as he dialed, and the phone rang only once before his father answered. "Jimmy?" Chief Washington's voice, usually calm and commanding, carried a hint of concern. "Dad, two officers, they're following me. They're acting strange," Jimmy whispered, his voice quivering. Hearing his son's words sent a jolt through Andre Washington. In his line of work, he'd seen too many situations escalate unnecessarily. The very officers sworn to serve and protect could sometimes act on biases rather than facts. Slamming his office door behind him, he grabbed his keys and bolted toward Oakwood. His mind raced as he navigated the streets, determination burning in his chest. Meanwhile, on the corner of Maple Avenue, the situation was intensifying. "Stop right there," Officer Grant barked, his gruff voice slicing through the air. Jimmy froze, clutching the small box tighter. Turning slowly, he tried to maintain composure as the officers approached, their heavy boots echoing ominously on the pavement. "Where do you think you're going, kids?" Grant demanded, his tone more accusatory than curious. "To my grandmother's house, sir," Jimmy replied, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. He gestured down the road. "It's just a few blocks away." But his answer didn't satisfy them. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? Got anything in your pockets we should know about?" Grant continued, his tone laced with suspicion. Jimmy's heart pounded as he stammered, Just this box. It's a gift for my grandma." Without warning, Grant reached for Jimmy's pockets, pulling them inside out. Crumpled tissues, a couple of quarters, and the box he carried for his grandmother were all he had. Yet Grant's demeanor didn't change. "You shouldn't be wandering around here, kid," Grant snapped, towering over Jimmy. The younger officer, Baker, stood silently behind his partner, his eyes darting between Grant and Jimmy. There was uncertainty in Baker's posture, a hesitance that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. Still, he followed Grant's lead, his silence complicit. Jimmy's phone buzzed in his pocket. His dad was calling back. Relief washed over him as he quickly answered. "Dad, please hurry," Jimmy murmured into the receiver, his voice barely audible. "I'm almost there, son. Stay calm," Chief Washington replied, his voice steady but laced with urgency. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, the streets of Oakwood blurring past him. Back on the corner, Grant continued to press Jimmy. "Kids like you shouldn't be walking around neighborhoods like this. Are you carrying anything illegal?" "No, sir," Jimmy said, his voice cracking slightly as he looked up at the officer. His hands trembled, but he kept his gaze steady. The situation hung in a precarious balance. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and things could spiral out of control. And all Jimmy could do was hope his father would arrive in time to defuse the growing storm. Jimmy's attempts to explain himself fell on deaf ears, his words drowned out by the officer's unfounded suspicions. The questions kept coming, their tone more accusatory with every passing moment. Just as a wave of helplessness began to settle over him, Jimmy caught sight of a familiar black car pulling up at the corner. Relief surged through him. It was his father. The sleek vehicle came to a decisive stop, and the door swung open to reveal Chief Andre Washington stepping out. Although dressed in casual clothes, his presence was nonetheless commanding. His expression blended calm authority with stern determination. Officer Grant and Officer Baker turned, their faces betraying a mix of confusion and dread as they recognized their superior. Chief Washington, sir," Grant stammered, his confidence evaporating. Chief Washington didn't respond immediately. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, first landing on his visibly shaken son, then shifting to the officers. His silence was more powerful than any words. "Would one of you care to explain what's going on here?" he finally asked, his voice measured but resolute. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, neither eager to speak. Finally, Grant, now pale and fidgeting, took a step forward. "Chief, we thought he looked suspicious, sir." "He didn't look like he belonged in this neighborhood," Grant muttered, avoiding eye contact. Washington's expression didn't soften. If anything, the disappointment in his eyes deepened. "Suspicious," he repeated, his voice dropping to a chilling calm. "My son was suspicious?" Grant faltered, unable to respond. "This is my neighborhood," the chief continued, his tone unrelenting. "He's visiting his grandmother just down the road. Tell me, does a young boy, walking in broad daylight with nothing but a gift for his grandmother, truly look like a threat to you?" Baker, the younger officer, swallowed hard. "Sir, we didn't know," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to ask," Washington said sharply. "Instead, you assumed. You let your prejudices cloud your judgment, and in doing so, you harassed an innocent boy." His words cut through the air like a blade, and both officers shifted uncomfortably under his piercing gaze. Chief Washington stepped closer, his towering presence magnifying the gravity of his words. "From this moment forward, you will treat every single person in this community with the respect they deserve. I expect you to handle your duties with fairness, with dignity, and without assumption. Because today, you crossed a line this department cannot and will not tolerate." Both officers nodded, their regret etched into their faces. "Yes, Chief," they murmured, their voices subdued. Washington finally turned back to his son, placing a reassuring hand on Jimmy's shoulder. "Let's go, son," he said, his voice gentler now. As they walked away, Jimmy felt a surge of pride for his father. The man who stood up for him today wasn't just his dad. He was a leader, a force for justice in a world that didn't always play fair.